Hello. Good evening, everybody. We're going to get started. I'm not going to be like one of my undergraduates and read from my phone. I'm holding it up to remind you to turn yours off. I'm delighted to welcome you all to Disarming Toxic Empire. It's the inaugural conference of the Sissy Farenthold Fund for Peace and Social Justice at the Bernard and Audrey Rappaport Center for Human Rights and Justice. I'm Neville Hode, co-director of the Rappaport Center, and I teach in the English department here at UT. On behalf of my co-director, Law Professor Karen Engel, our postdoctoral fellow Cooper Christiansi, and the entire Rappaport Center team, welcome to this critical conversation on environmental justice, nuclear disarmament, and peace. A conversation that has deep implications for the past, present, and future of our planet and all of those who inhabit it. I have many people to thank, and that long list will reveal the necessity of extensive collaboration in broaching the topics of disarming toxic empire. So I'm going to try and do that, and then Karen will introduce our keynote speaker. We meet on the indigenous lands of Turtle Island, the ancestral name for what now is called North America. I would like to acknowledge the Alabama Cushada, Caddo, the Kuriza Kamakrudo, the Koyawatakan, Comanche, Kickapoo, Lipan Apache, Tonkawa, and Islita del Sur Puebla, and all of the American Indian and indigenous peoples and communities who have been or have become a part of these lands and territories we now call Texas. This land acknowledgement is particularly resonant because the conference attempts to center indigenous experiences and responses in relation to nuclear colonialism, as well as the forms of militarism, dispossession, and extraction that uphold it. Disarming Toxic Empire is a project of the newly established Sissy Farenthold Fund. Karen will talk more about Sissy. We are grateful for her legacy and would like to express our thanks to the donors of the Sissy Farenthold Fund, some of you who are with us, others are watching online from all over the world. If you're interested in learning more about Sissy and supporting the fund's critical work, you could refer to the information in the program or visit our website. And on the website, there's a little button called Donate, which I urge you all to press. It feels quite nice. Organizing this conference was an exceptionally collaborative effort, featuring contributions from over 18 different organizations at UT. Tonight's keynote event was made possible by the Swedish Excellent Endowment and the Barbara Osher Pro Swecker Foundation Excellence Endowment. So I didn't know that the University of Texas had a Swedish Excellence Endowment Fund, and it was very nice to tap into them. We are immensely grateful to them and to many other conference co-sponsors. Texas Global, the Center for European Studies, Center for Middle Eastern Studies, the France UT Institute, the Humanities Institute, the Charles N. Wilson Chair in South Asian Studies and the Department of Government, Planet Texas 2050, Center for East Asian Studies, South Asia Institute, the Oscar Brockett Center for Theater History and Performance as Public Practice in the Department of Theater and Dance, the Briscoe Center for American History, the Program in Native American and Indigenous Studies, Rude Mex, and Texas Physicians for Social Responsibility. Now, I nearly ran out of breath reading that list, but I think it suggests the breadth and scope of concern and expertise around the issues that we want to focus on in this conference. I mean, it did take the whole campus to allow us to start thinking about disarming toxic empire in a serious way. The intellectual, financial, and administrative support offered by our partners made this conference into a globe-spanning event featuring a stunning array of activists, artists, archivists, and academics. And you can notice I'm still stuck in the letter A. From West Campus to Sweden to Fiji. If you are one of those people speaking or exhibiting at the conference, please stand up. Don't make me beg. I want to take you to church easily. I see some of you are shy, but hopefully that will change over the course of the next day. We are further grateful to many UT colleagues who were invaluable in the conception of the conference, especially Rosemary Candelario, Abinadab Asaya Asara, and Will Wilson. Nothing happens without the wonderful staff of the Rappaport Center. And I know sometimes we're a toxic workplace, so I just want to apologize for any craziness we've inflicted on you over the last week. In addition to Cooper Christianse's intellectual lead on the conference, Caroline Hahn, Quinn Willett-Cray, and many of our student interns and scholars played a vital role in the complex logistics that enable our meeting together. Okay, so I'm sorry the thanks took so long. They could have taken longer because so many people have been so wonderful. Our aspirations for this conference are at least threefold. We aim to be interdisciplinary, critical, and intergenerational on the questions we have shorthanded in the 3 words, disarming toxic empire. In terms of the interdisciplinary, 40 years ago, French philosopher Jacques Derrida wrote for a colloquium on nuclear criticism. The stakes of the nuclear question are those of humanity, of the humanities. For this reason, the conference refuses to think about the nuclear as only a question of military or economic policy, though those frames are obviously important. As the list of our collaborators suggests, our participants approach the question of the nuclear toxicity, and nuclear colonialism from diverse geographies, methodological approaches, artistic perspectives, and perhaps most importantly, lived experiences. Your program will also alert you to the extraordinary photographs from the Briscoe Center collection and from Professor Wilson's Connecting the Dot project. And there's some up here today, and there will be some in the venue tomorrow. I mean, they're really worth looking at. Okay, on the critical. While we open the conference tonight with a focus on nuclear weapons, the conference in general emphasizes the conjoining of the nuclear, the environmental, and the human. Disarmament, therefore, involves the elimination of toxic weaponries, technologies, ideologies, and imaginaries. I don't think anyone can accuse us of a lack of ambition. We explore the links between world-ending nuclear weaponry and unchecked environmental degradation. Empire, in both its continuing territorial and deterritorialized assertions of sovereignty, remains the broadest and most essential temporal and geographic frame for understanding the spectacularly uneven distribution of nuclear harms and benefits. While nuclear annihilation has often been imagined as a universal threat, there are specific racial geographies to those who have been most subject to nuclear toxicity, generally populations dehumanized in the eyes of the powerful. Okay, lastly, intergenerational. We refuse the fantasy that nuclear questions should be consigned to a bygone era. Indeed, our conference is multiply intergenerational, invoking not just the different generations of history that are studied by our panelists, but also thinking about the past, present, and future of the nuclear age across these racialized geographies simultaneously. As Hiro Miyazaki and Annalise Riles, 2 thinkers you'll hear from later in the conference, have observed, nuclear weapons invoke elements of both the intergenerational justice of war memory, with its focus on the transmission of commitment to remembering the violences of the past, and the intergenerational justice of climate action, with its call to action on behalf of somewhat abstract and unrealized future generations. So there's a way in which the question of nuclear and climate change forces us to look backwards and forwards in this often quite dizzying way. Today we think about generational horrors in different registers. Not just the horror of the end of the world, but the horror of what Rob Nixon calls slow violence, the slow and steady poisoning of land, water, peoples, In uncovering histories of nuclear colonialism and nuclear disaster, our panelists need to read across generations and geographies. Okay, before we start, a few matters of housekeeping. Whether you are here in person or virtually, we want to hear your questions as the evening progresses. You could submit questions and comments, all of which will be passed to the speakers, but I fear the speakers might be overwhelmed by the flood of them, so please don't get upset if we don't get to your question. So you can use the QR code posted above or distributed throughout the room. Okay, so I'm old-fashioned. I like a menu in a restaurant. I hate a QR code. For those of you who are like me, there are note cards, and so you can write in pencil. And we will collect them for the Q&A. Those watching the live stream can also send in your questions by visiting rappaportcenter.org and clicking the Disarming Empire Q&A button, or sending your questions via email to, and this is easy to remember, humanrights@law.utexas.edu. Today's program will begin with a presentation by Beatrice Fihn, our keynote speaker, followed by a roundtable. You are also all encouraged to attend our full day of panels tomorrow. For our concluding performance, we will transition to East Austin for a solo live performance of a body in Fukushima by the renowned interdisciplinary movement artist Aiko Otake. We recently got fully booked, so we've opened up a second performance, so please register. I think that one starts at 8 o'clock, am I right? 9. Okay, thank you. See, Cooper keeps us all in line. Throughout, we hope to open new knowledges about the past and the present of toxic empires, to think about the remediation and repair that might be required for more just futures. I would now like to turn over the podium to Karen Engel, who also deserves massive thanks for organizing and, in a way, being the leading light of the Rappaport Center. And Karen will tell us a little bit, so I didn't mean to cut the floor short. Karen will tell us a little bit more about Sissy Farenthold and introduce our keynote speaker. So thank you and welcome.
Thank you, Neville. Good evening, all. It's great to see so many old friends here and many new friends, I'm hoping for, and collaborators. So it's quite a group we have. I want to begin by reinforcing Neville's appreciation for the many, many people who have made this conference possible in so many ways. And a lot of you are in here, so thank you. And we hope we can live up to your expectations. I think we will. So that includes not only the many people who Neville named, but also those who have engaged in anti-nuclear and environmental work for decades. One of those people was Sissy Farenthold. And I'll talk about this more in my presentation tomorrow afternoon, but our work in Sissy's papers, which are housed at the University of Texas at the Briscoe Center, and many are on the Rappaport Center website, planted the seeds for the ideas and conversations that grew into this conference. We were particularly inspired by documentation by Sissy and her cousin Genevieve Vaughn on their organization of the 1985 Peace Tent in Nairobi, and their involvement with Women for a Meaningful Summit, which was an ad hoc group of women who came together as private or citizen diplomats to attempt to influence the Reagan and Gorbachev summits on nuclear weapons. Their work on disarmament was inextricably linked with their commitment to environmental justice. Now, for Sissy, anti-nuclear activism aimed to break through what Helen Caldicott had labeled psychic numbing, caused by the existential threat of nuclear disaster. Sissy insisted that, quote, we must move beyond this awesome awareness of the danger before us to formulate alternatives and implement action. Sissy would be proud, I am certain, to see her name associated with this event, especially with the formidable, path-breaking international lawyer and peace activist delivering tonight's keynote address, Beatrice Fihn. In 2017, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, or ICAN, received the Nobel Peace Prize for, in the words of the committee, quote, its work to draw attention to the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of any use of nuclear weapons, and for its groundbreaking efforts to achieve a treaty-based prohibition of such weapons, end quote. It's my honor tonight to introduce you to the person who accepted the prize on behalf of ICAN, Beatrice Fihn, who was at the helm of the organization for nearly a decade and led its successful efforts toward the adoption of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, or TPNW, as you'll hear it referenced a lot tonight. The treaty is the only international convention committed to the comprehensive elimination of nuclear weapons. And Beatrice accepted the prize alongside anti-nuclear activist and atomic bomb survivor Setsuko Thurlow. Beatrice comes to us this evening as director of a non-governmental organization she recently launched called Lex International, which works with civil society movements, academics, scientists, international organizations, governments, media, and businesses to use international law to, quote, shape new global norms and create bold, innovative solutions to global challenges. Not a modest aim, but Beatrice is as poised for it as anyone. Indeed, she has already been recognized as one of the Bloomberg's 50 most influential people. That was in 2017. Was a recipient of a special Lifetime Achievement Award at Tribeca Disruptive Innovation Awards, and received the 2018 Honorary Citizen of the Year Award from her hometown of Gothenburg, Sweden. Tonight, we've asked Beatrice to offer her perspective from the front row of history, reflecting on her experiences in mobilizing civil society to prohibit and eliminate nuclear weapons. On Beatrice's watch, ICAN amassed a broad coalition of students, artists, lawyers, doctors, scientists, and environmental and racial justice activists in 652 partner organizations across 110 countries. And together they achieved a lot. Bringing this broad participation to the movement has been key to Beatrice's efforts to change the narrative around nuclear weapons, to break us through the psychic numbing, or as she puts it, to make something that is acceptable suddenly become unacceptable. Part of that work she maintains is cultural. So Beatrice communicates in ways that get a broad array of people to pay attention, from including references to Beyoncé in a UN speech and getting diplomats to talk with activists about nuclear weapons in between karaoke numbers. So anybody who's looking for some questions to ask her, there are a couple. To calling for global leaders to visit Hiroshima and Nagasaki to listen to the Hibakusha, the survivors of atomic bombings, quote, to really understand what it means to use nuclear weapons. Now, especially given the number of students in the room, I think it's important to point out that Beatrice didn't always imagine herself as the leader of an international disarmament movement. Before receiving her master's in law from the University of London, Beatrice studied international relations at Stockholm University. And as a student, she was excited to secure an internship with the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom in Switzerland, in Geneva. But she went there, and it seems, as she said, she was a bit disappointed at first because she was assigned to work on disarmament. At the time, she later recalled, I'm sure she didn't say it at the time, she thought it would be, quote, super boring, really old school, irrelevant. But she persevered, and we're very grateful that she did in her internship and well beyond, as we continue to need her perspective on this unfortunately still highly relevant issue. So please join me in welcoming Beatrice Fihn.
Thank you so much. I completely had forgotten about how a colleague and I had a competition about who could get the most Beyoncé quotes into a UN statement. I think she won with 4. It's such a huge honor and privilege to be here, and I really want to thank the University of Texas at Austin, the Rappaport Center, and the Sissy Fantel Fund for inviting me here, bringing me to Austin. It's such a joy to be here at this incredibly important topic. It could not be more relevant than it is today. I'm also incredibly grateful to the Swedish Excellent Endowment and the Barbara Osher Pro Swedish Foundation Excellent Endowment for enabling me to come here. So thank you very much. Tack så mycket in Swedish. And I am not so surprised that there are 2 Swedish endowments because as Swedes, we're a very small country. And we kind of had to figure out very early on that in order to survive in the world, we have to collaborate. We have to invest in diplomacy and international issues. And we prioritize that just as much as maybe some of the big countries prioritize their militaries. And it's just a survival strategy. So, you know, we pop up a little bit everywhere in the world. Every time I tell people that I work on nuclear disarmament, I very often get quite a strange reaction. I mean, sometimes it can be a nice, strange reaction. So, wow, that's very important. Good for you. Or, good luck with that. But whether or not it's positive or negative, there's always almost an inbuilt reaction that sort of oozes, that's just impossible. And very recently, about a week and a half, maybe 2 weeks ago, New York Times released a new series of articles, a series of opinion articles about nuclear weapons. And they launched it with this big story about the consequences of nuclear weapons use. So, you know, typical New York Times fashion, very advanced graphics, things swooshing on the website when you scroll it. And it also popped up in my Instagram feed. The algorithm knows us well. And I looked at this very well-designed, well-informed post, and then, of course, as you do, go to the comments. And it was quite interesting to see how people responded to this. And not maybe the New York Times readers, but people on social media. WTF. Why would you share this now, people wrote. And perhaps most fascinating of all, many different versions of why would you make us think about this when there's absolutely nothing we can do? So this kind of feeling of impossibleness of this issue is sort of hanging over it. Now, I understand it. It does feel overwhelming. And I think in particularly these days where in just a few years we've gone through a deadly pandemic, we're charging towards irreversible climate catastrophe. We see skyrocketing inequalities, and we're blasted with pictures of war, violence, and death all the time. The need that we have right now for environmental justice, peace, and real human security is more than ever, maybe. But we also feel, I think, that we have this joint feeling of hopelessness and very sort of disillusioned about the future. And I think in particular for young people. And I think it's understandable that people do feel like that about nuclear weapons, because it's in part very intentional by those who want to keep nuclear weapons to make us feel like that. The way nuclear weapons have been described and how they're visualized in very strange ways are impersonal, theoretical, like they've always been around. And we tend to explain the world with the assumption that nuclear weapons, they just are. That it's normal to have nuclear weapons. And it's very hard for people to challenge those underlying assumptions when it's people in power who kind of put them there. And we tend to talk about it, even people who work on this issue sometimes, like we don't have agency, like we don't have ability to change these things. Like the risks of nuclear war is just out of our hands, and we have to sit back, accept it, and just hope for the best, cross our fingers. But the risks of nuclear weapons and nuclear weapons themselves are not a natural phenomenon that we need to live with. It's not a natural disaster that just one day strikes. It's not an earthquake, it's not an asteroid falling down on Earth. The existence of nuclear weapons and the risk of them being used is a choice that people make every day. Leaders of nuclear armed states, spokespeople for defense ministries, operators of nuclear weapons, companies that build nuclear weapons, universities and scientists involved in the research project of these, are every day taking actions to maintain or increase this risk. It's not a natural state. It's specific interests and actions done by individuals that enables the risk of use of nuclear weapons to be unacceptably high. And if people stop doing those things, the challenge of eliminating nuclear weapons would suddenly not be very daunting at all. So today I really wanted to talk about how regular people, and not even that many of them, decided to take on some of the most powerful countries in the world and put into a law a new treaty prohibiting nuclear weapons, and how we're going to work to use that to eliminate them, and how we, particularly in 3 different ways, are working. How we, 1, shift the way we talk about nuclear weapons, and 2, make it into a humanitarian issue, and 3, mobilize new voices and new actors. And one of the first ways that we do this is to really shift what framing we use, how we talk about these weapons, and what words and images we use. The story about nuclear weapons is very often told with phrases that centers around nuclear powers or superpowers. Just the idea of putting powers and associate power and prestige with these weapons. And nothing can change that. We very often hear these weapons have kept the peace since 1945. They've stopped the World War III. Countries will always want to have them. They'll never give them up. These are very standard phrases that we just almost accept as truths. But however, we could also tell a story about nuclear weapons in a very different way. That out of 200 countries in the world, only 9 have them. Around 180, 190 governments do not have these weapons. And about 160 countries don't even have security policies that are connected to nuclear weapons, like in alliances or anything like that. And it's not because of some technical difficulty to have these weapons. It's not that advanced. It's 1940s technology. And it's not that these countries are just living in peace and have no single security concern on the horizon. And it's not that these leaders are just ethical and moral and better than others. It's just that most countries in the world think that nuclear weapons do not make them safer. That is actually the normal ways for governments to behave. But we very often don't think about it in that way. And so I think we need to talk about these issues, that almost all the countries in the world have the technical capability to develop nuclear weapons, but every day, even under the most challenging geopolitical context that we see right now, they choose not to. Despite the wars, despite the security threats, they choose to not develop nuclear weapons. We can also tell a story about nuclear weapons that there's actually not that much evidence that nuclear weapons have kept the peace. Correlation is not causation. If we want to say those things, for example, we can also say that the United Nations have kept the peace, just as much as nuclear weapons. No world war has happened since the UN was formed. No permanent member of the Security Council has gone to war with each other since the UN was formed. That's also an alternative story we could tell around this. We can also tell the story about how much success we actually have had in this work. We have banned and eliminated biological weapons. We banned and eliminated chemical weapons. We have prohibited nuclear testing. And we actually prevented nuclear weapons from proliferating to further countries. And we probably have prevented them from being used. Every day that we wake up and nuclear weapons have not been used, that's a victory for humanity. And these things, these victories, were actually achieved through international law, norms, and political pressure. So this has really been one of the main strategies of ICAN and the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, to change what we think is normal. Change who gets to own the discourse and set the narrative on these issues, and change the perception of these weapons. And this is actually a really important strategy, because out of all the types of weapons that exist in the world, I think nuclear weapons might be the weapon that is the most vulnerable to people's opinions. Because think about it, they're actually really useless in warfare. Their power and their value is in their ability to deter, which relies on what people think of them. They derive their only power, their only sort of utility from what people think about them. That makes them also uniquely vulnerable to our opinions and the way we talk about them. And that's something that we have to utilize, and that's how we form this strategy about delegitimizing nuclear weapons. So the second thing, following from that, was, of course, to turn nuclear weapons from a purely security issue or political issue into a humanitarian issue. And it was really starting by looking at what the weapon do to people, what the weapon really are, and being honest about it. They're weapons of mass destruction. They're big radioactive bombs that create catastrophic humanitarian suffering if used. They violate all laws of war and are actually completely useless in warfare. The impact of these weapons will cross borders and stay for generations. And we also made sure that experts on nuclear weapons got the center stage in the conversation around these weapons. And by experts, I mean the people who truly know what nuclear weapons are and what they do to people. The survivors and victims of nuclear weapons use and testing, centering the experiences from Hibakusha, from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the people from communities around nuclear test sites, Marshall Islands, Fiji, Kiribati, Kazakhstan, Algeria, United States, Australia, and many more. These are the people who know how your community looks like after nuclear weapons have been used or tested. They know what happens to the cities, what happens to people's bodies, what happens to people's livelihoods. These are the real experts on nuclear weapons, not some suits sitting in capitals writing strategic stability papers sometimes. And the research and factual evidence and first-hand experiences presented at these kind of different meetings around the process of negotiating the treaty made it really clear that nuclear weapons affect everyone in all countries, regardless of borders, economic circumstances, and geopolitical alignment or military might. So the third thing that we did around this treaty was to use that reframing and use the humanitarian arguments to empower new voices. Because nuclear weapons are not just the concern of a small number of nuclear-armed states and their nuclear weapons-dependent allies. It's the responsibility of all states and therefore also all people. Like climate change and pandemic diseases, nuclear weapons are a global problem, and it really requires a global response. Not one country can solve this on their own. And this was really a tremendously empowering realization that led directly to the negotiations and the creations of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So through defining the nuclear weapons as a humanitarian problem, not a political one, and with the global majority involved, not just the 9 nuclear-armed states, we created this new way of looking at nuclear weapons. And through these 3 steps, we convinced over 120 governments to negotiate and conclude a treaty that comprehensively bans nuclear weapons in 2017. And they ban it because of the humanitarian consequences and creates a responsibility for states also to support communities impacted by nuclear weapons. The treaty entered into force in 2021, and despite it being entered into force, it still continues to enable so many practical ways of different voices and different communities to get involved. First, of course, we have on the state level and governments, we have 93 countries that have signed the treaty, 70 countries that have ratified it and put it into domestic law. And that number keeps on growing as we go. And every single state matters, small or large. And while, of course, many states out of these 200 in the world are pretty small, I think it's important to remember that this treaty is not just a treaty for small countries. And actually, out of the 10 countries with the biggest populations in the world, 5 have signed the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And these 5 are also the countries that are growing more than the other 5 who happens to be nuclear armed. Because the world is changing. And sort of the center that we created around North America and Europe is no longer the power dynamic of the world. And second, of course, as we heard earlier, ICAN consisted of over almost 700 organizations, and many more organizations are involved in this issue. Thousands of people engaged in this. From demonstrations to petitions to social media work to advocacy towards different actors, members of civil society are finding many different ways of getting involved in this and shift minds. But getting your government to join the treaty is not the only way for people to get involved, because through this treaty and through this movement, we are also finding new ways and different angles for people to contribute so that everyone has a role to play. For example, we have many trade unions that are engaging with this, with a lot of workplaces and in communities getting to be part of a network of trade unions. We have cities, a huge amount of cities have taken local, like city council decisions, and a member of ICAN cities appeals, like New York, Washington, LA, Paris, Berlin, Manchester, Barcelona. Last week, Rome joined this, would love for Austin to join, in case someone feels eager to go to the city council and work on that. And this is a really important way to get involved, because cities are responsible for the public's health. They are responsible for emergency relief coordination, for healthcare, and if a nuclear bomb is used, and these are city destroyers, that's what they're meant to do, these weapons, it is the city's responsibility. So the fact that cities are rising up and taking action on this is extremely important. We have faith-based communities all over the world, from the Pope and the Catholic Church, to the Dalai Lama, and many more religious leaders, also working locally to engage people. For example, the Catholic Church has made a lot of progress on working on nuclear weapons due to the Pope's really progressive stand on this issue. And bishops are organizing and talking in local communities about this and really empowering people to see it as their local issue. We're organizing that also, even if your government hasn't joined the treaty, elected representatives, senators, congresspeople, parliamentarians all around the world can join a growing community of elected representatives all over the world to support the treaty, even if their government is not against it. We organize these global meetings, for example, where parliamentarians and elected officials around the world can come together to discuss strategies, what can be done on a national level in a country that is not yet supportive, and really build confidence over borders. People work in banks or investments, for example. Financial institutions are also being organized and active on this issue, using the treaty as a legal basis for divesting from nuclear weapons producing companies. Every year in the Don't Bank on the Bomb research project that we have, we can see how more and more banks are pulling away investments from these companies that produce nuclear weapons. We've seen, for example, a country that signed the treaty, Ireland, had its sovereign wealth fund completely divest from all nuclear weapons producing companies as a result of the treaty. It's really pulling away money from this industry. And universities are encouraged not to contribute by engaging in research projects directly with nuclear weapons producing facilities. Sorry. Another group that's organized lately and had a big exhibition in New York in November is Artists Against the Bomb, a group of artists that are doing posters. From well-known artists to local artists are engaging as a way to use their creativity to communicate about the dangerous nuclear weapons. So I very often think about these issues as everyone has a role to play. Very often I get the questions like, oh, what should I do? And I always think a little bit about a good friend of mine who's a personal trainer and who talks about sort of people asking, what's the most effective way of working out? What's the most effective training? Is it Tabata intervals? Is it high intensity? Or is it this? And it's like, whatever you love to do. Because the most effective is what you keep doing for a long time. So whatever we love to do and whatever we're already doing, how can we incorporate nuclear weapons and anti-nuclear weapons activism into that as a way to also do this for the long term? Because it's genuinely space for everyone. And the beauty of working with a cause that is all about shifting perceptions and opinions is that everyone can do it. You can do it with your neighbor, you can do it with your government. And everything matters. So while we keep making progress on this treaty and keep working on this, of course, we can't deny that the world is getting increasingly difficult and hostile. We see increased hostile rhetoric between nuclear armed states, geopolitical tensions are growing, and even on my continent, Europe, we see more calls for nuclear weapons, also from some European states. It's extremely concerning right now. But at the same time, we also know that these processes are long-term. This is where we have to remember that history has also shown that at the moments of increased threats and crises, in the years following that, we see a huge amount of progress. In the few years after, I think it was 5-6 years after the Cuban Missile Crisis, governments came together to negotiate the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. At the height of the Cold War in the 80s, with Star Wars and Reagan and Gorbachev, very high tensions. A few years later, they met in Reykjavik and negotiated a huge reduction of nuclear arsenals. This can happen. We can turn these crises into something positive, and that's where we have to set the stage. I often look at it also, these issues, a little bit as surfing, that we have to be prepared for the waves. and not get dismayed when things are difficult, when we feel like we're being sucked out in the ocean again, but to keep pedaling and be ready to catch that next wave. So through the regular people, just working on this, through the now what we have that's different this time is the legal basis of the Treaty on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. We are continuing to create the political, economic, and cultural conditions that will make the elimination of nuclear weapons possible one day. And I hope that you will all help us on this journey. Thank you.
And as you were speaking, I really resonated with what you said about, firstly, about the impossible, seeking for the impossible. In the Marshall Islands, where we've had 67 nuclear tests detonated in our country, and 50 years throughout the Pacific with over 315 nuclear weapons, we have still not been able to see what we consider as justice. So with this really long legacy, we've just marked 77 years since Castle Bravo, which was the biggest test detonated by the US in 1954. The idea of justice for people in the Pacific, for our grandparents, our ancestors, is something that's not really, it's a faraway concept. It's never going to happen. Many of them have passed away, and a lot of young people are now taking up the fight, but it's really hard to stay hopeful. And as I was listening to your backstory as well about, getting into disarmament, I was reminded by a Marshallese woman who also took up the cause for nuclear justice and disarmament in the 1980s. Her name is Darlene Keju, and she spoke at the World Council of Churches about the experiences that women had with miscarriages. They were giving birth to what they called jellyfish babies, babies born with no eyes or bones, and trying to raise awareness for what was happening back home. And she was met with a lot of opposition as a young person and as a woman. And her government, the government tried to put her in the health sector, thinking that, okay, maybe she won't, she'll be able to focus on that. But then she used that as a way to continue to advocate. And so 2 things from that stuck out to me is what you said about doing what you love, like lifting wherever you are standing. It's something that we advocate for at our youth organization, that everyone has a role that they can play. But I was wondering, when things seem hopeful, like it does, hopeless, like it does sometimes, or when you're faced with like criticism and challenges and backlash, as a young woman, as a nuclear disarmament advocate, what keeps you going?
I guess I was going to ask a little bit about non-proliferation, because you had mentioned it as sort of a step towards disarmament. And of course, within the Global South, there's often been a critique of non-proliferation as, in some sense, an approach that sort of is sort of a Trojan horse for in fact war, or for a dominant world order, in some sense, that the non-proliferation regime has both been something that has sort of entrenched and reproduced or consolidated both the military and the political power of powerful countries, and also and in the name of the non-proliferation, has caused enormous harm. The sanctions against Iran just being one example, and makes it so. Yeah, I guess I just wanted to get and it seems like the treaty about the abolition is actually very much an alternative rather than something that's continuous with the non-proliferation regime. So I was just going to ask a little about that.
Yeah, it's so wonderful to be here with the 3 of you. Also extremely inspirational, all 3 of you. I think a lot of this has, one of the things that I'm thinking that sort of ties all these questions together as well is the sort of challenging power and challenging power structures in a way. And we have so many different layers of injustice and oppression in society, and they're all very connected. Just referencing like how when I first started this work and got an opportunity to do an internship about nuclear weapons, and my first reaction was that, oh, that's so lame. Like, that was genuinely true. Because I was so much more interested in things like global justice. And I just did not see, before I learned about nuclear weapons, how connected it was. Because the way that we talk about nuclear weapons, like I explained earlier, is so stale and focused on some sort of theory, and we don't elevate the stories about nuclear testing, for example, or the stories about the consequences of non-proliferation sort of work that has harmed a lot of people. So I think it's absolutely connected to the feminist movement, it's connected to anti-colonialism, it's connected to indigenous people's rights, it's connected to anti-racism, this idea of responsible nuclear weapon states versus irresponsible nuclear weapon states. I think all of those movements are really connected. If there's tension between them, I think that there's for me, who are seeing all of these power structures, sometimes I'm a part of the oppressive power as a white person, and sometimes I'm, with men because they are power structure. So I think that our roles are very different in that. I also know that in these movements you will have different comfort levels with challenging different power structures. And the challenge, I think, from civil society is to how open are we for people who accept one part and maybe not all of these things? And that's a bit of a balancing act. What keeps me going? Honestly, the people in this movement, like yourself, like all the people that are part of ICAN, sometimes we have this, people want to be a part of movements that are succeeding. And you can sort of sense when you're in an upwards momentum, more and more people want to join. It's very human nature. But I think it's also really important to think about this, that this is not a winning or losing things. Like, we're just going to have to do this forever. So many of these fights, women's rights, look at this country, like fights that you thought that you'd won is suddenly being rolled back. We can never ever think we're done with any of these causes because power structures are oppressive, and even if we get rid of one, there will be other power structures that will be oppressive. So I think also we have to kind of not think that we're going to tick this one off and then move on to something else and live happily ever after. It's constant work, and not in a depressing way, in just this is what we do, right? This is how we protest, and I feel like that also very much with other issues, with the climate, with things that you feel like it has a moment, you're like, oh, maybe it's going to happen, and then you feel like it's going backwards almost, or people forget about it, not talk about it anymore. I think it's really important to remember that just because issues are not in the media doesn't mean that people aren't working on it. And that when attention goes away, nobody talks about Syria anymore. There's still organizations working in Syria. They're still giving out aid. They're still documenting war crimes. They're still trying to clear like landmines in places. It's ongoing work that just keeps going. And there's a lot of people that keep doing this work. And that's what we have to kind of find faith in. And finally, on the non-proliferation side, like, yes, I absolutely agree with you. It's extremely problematic. Of course, non-proliferation is good. We don't want more countries to develop nuclear weapons. But the way it's been framed and the way we've talked about it as that's the biggest threat. More people think that Iran, that doesn't have nuclear weapons, is a threat than the US 7,000 nuclear weapons. When it comes to nuclear weapons, that threat. So, of course, and there's also this kind of, one of the things we've been thinking a lot about media's role and how they talk about these things, that you have this kind of, almost like, just new developments of nuclear weapons. So it's a bigger story about Iran than the countries that have nuclear weapons, because we kind of accepted in our minds that that's just a fact and that's going to happen forever. So we're no longer interested in that. And it's fascinating to see how I've always reacted to people. I think it's a very frequently in the US, I don't hear it so much in other countries, that they call the topic, this topic that we talk about, they call it, non-proliferation.
Yeah.
I'm like, no, well, nuclear weapons, right?
Yeah.
But it's framed in a way, and even people who generally, they mean disarmament when they say it, but they use the word non-proliferation because that's what's been sort of indoctrinated in our head, which of course just means other countries, right? Not the existing nuclear weapon states. So I, of course, think that the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons is a genuine non-proliferation treaty too. They prevent new countries from developing it, but also tackles the existing countries in that way. So I absolutely agree that it's a problematic narrative, and I think that the TPNW has done trying to correct that in that way. But I think it is, I mean, right now, of course, it's a very it's a challenging time for international law in general. And I think that I'm probably not the only one who just gets increasingly angry and feeling like, oh, what does these laws and treaties mean, even if I'm very attached to ours, of course, and genuinely believe in it. And I think that there's this balance between being critical of the instruments that we build and how they are not able to always stop government from doing bad things, but also knowing that these are normative. Nobody can stop a government from doing something, really. It's normative shifts, and the more we support these instruments, the more power they will have. And I've been thinking a lot lately about our roles as civil society, who've been so close to these instruments. When do we criticize them? When do we criticize the treaties that are failing people in Gaza, for example, the institutions failing people there? And when do we say, no, wait, they are really important, we need to promote them, to put more pressure on governments to follow them? And that, again, I don't know where that line is drawn. I think we have to constantly sit with a lot of discomfort and sit with a lot of being challenged on those things from different sides. But I absolutely think that we have to question this. And one thing that I've been thinking a lot about lately is how it feels like the world order is kind of under so much pressure and crumbling. And some of the things that we built after World War II, like the United Nations and the Geneva Conventions and the structures, are very, very good. But there were some very fundamental flaws and like cancers at the root of that system. I think nuclear weapons are one. And I think the permanent members of the Security Council is one. And I think Israel and Palestine and the way that we solved that after World War II was wrong. And it's these kind of inconsistency where laws have been used to give different status. And that's some kind of international law apartheid. And I think the TPNW is one way to address that on the nuclear weapon side. And of course, it's a very scary moment, but I also think as a system that has flaws is cracking, we also get an opportunity to build a better system, a system that is more just, where we have this international law that actually recognizes everyone as equal. And in general, like I see some of these treaties, laws and institutions that we feel are not working at the moment or not enough to stop things. I think we also have to see them as kind of anchor points that helps us hold on to what's right and what's wrong. It's not the treaty's purpose is not always to stop bad things from happening, but just to admit that it's a bad thing. And I think in particular as we see in propaganda and these narratives, and you know, we can see the same incident and completely different perspective on what's happening. And I, even though I'm experienced in this field, find it very difficult to know what's happening and what's the truth. So for me, the international treaties are a bit of a way to hold on to something that no matter what happens, I'm like, it's wrong to bomb schools, right? It's wrong to bomb hospitals. That's illegal. And I can hold on to that even if I see it happening. I can sort of have the also kind of find the sort of that as a navigation point a little bit, that I'm able to say, even though it's scary sometimes to speak out on things, I'm able to say that that's wrong and that's illegal under international law. Because there's a law, there's the Geneva Conventions, there's these treaties that say that it's wrong. And something now I'm hoping that can be a way for people with nuclear weapons. For example, the treaty prohibits threats to use nuclear weapons. So when Russia threatens to use nuclear weapons, It's not a political issue. The law says it's wrong. It's wrong if the US would do it. It's wrong if any country would do it. It doesn't matter if it's your enemy or it's your friend or your ally. It's wrong. I think that's also a very important purpose of international law, that even if we see them being violated, we need to hold on to. But in order for that to work, the laws have to be written in a just way and not these unjust laws that some of them that we have.
Thank you. Before I share, I just want to thank the organizers, the Rappaport Center, the Sissy Fund, and all of you for inviting me here today. I want to acknowledge the traditional leaders of this land, ancestors of this land, past, present, and future. And I'm just really grateful to be here. So just to give you some backstory about the Pacific, as I have said, we have been a testing ground for over 315 nuclear weapons tested by the US, the United Kingdom, and France. And in the Marshall Islands, we withstood 67 known nuclear and thermonuclear weapons in our northern atolls of Enewetak and Bikini from 1946 to 1958. One of these weapons was codenamed Castle Bravo, which yielded 15 megatons, 1,000 times more powerful than the ones detonated in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, Japan. So powerful that it vaporized 3 of the islets on Bikini Atoll. It was the biggest and most powerful weapon ever detonated by the US government. While the US nuclear tests were conducted at Bikini and Enewetak atolls, the fallout traveled to other atolls in the Marshall Islands, especially Rongelap Atoll and Wutuduk Atoll. The people were not informed about what was happening, and the Rongelap people had pleaded to be evacuated for 30 years after experiencing horrific birth complications, including miscarriages and birth defects. Under the guise of administering care, the US subjected the people to more violence, including illegal and covert experiments under top secret medical lab study known as Project 4.1 to, quote, test the biological impacts of nuclear weapons on human beings, unquote. At the cause of great exploitation, they suffered great loss. I once read a quote by President Harry Truman after the bombs in Hiroshima. He said, "It is a terrible weapon, and it should not be used on innocent men, women, and children." After reading this, I thought, are we not human beings? Are we not men, women, and children? So I thank Beatrice for acknowledging the intersections of colonialism, racism, sovereignty, geopolitics, and many different issues that have contributed to this nuclear legacy. Despite our tragic history, Pacific peoples also carry a history of tremendous bravery, resilience, and vision. While enduring 50 years of nuclear violence, up until 1996, I had no idea that nuclear bombs were being tested so close to me after I was born. They mobilized, advocated, and successfully established remarkable strides for nuclear justice and disarmament. In the 1970s, Pacific youth assembled and organized what is known as the Nuclear Free and Independent Pacific Movement. It was largely fostered and nurtured by faith-based organizations like the one that I work for today. Carrying fears about nuclear tests, young people also held ambition for sovereignty and environmental sustainability for our islands and oceans, largely occupied by colonial superpowers. At the beginning of this month, we marked 77 years after the first tests after the Castle Bravo tests in the Marshall Islands. 70 years, sorry. 70 years after the Castle Bravo test. And the impacts of radiation continue to linger in our island homes. On Enewetak Atoll, there is a crater filled with nuclear waste, a tomb, we call it. The Runit Dome, which houses nuclear waste from the tests in the Marshall Islands. The US had promised to remove it, but it still remains there to this day. And due to climate change, 90% of the plutonium in it has already leaked into our oceans. For young people based in the Pacific and Fiji, the words, "My fish is your fish," has been our beacon of hope for nuclear justice. We shared our love for the oceans and islands, highlighting how the ocean provides for us to bring in more people into the nuclear justice movement. MISA for the Pacific started at a university just like this, where young people realized that we don't really know much about our nuclear history. I, a Marshallese person, had no idea that there were tests going on in Tahiti or Kiribati, and that there were servicemen from many Pacific countries called to clean up the waste. And so we began MISA for the Pacific movement, which grew from just 40 people assembling together on Nuclear Victims Remembrance Day on March 1st to over 300 plus supporters marching every year through the streets of Suva, reminding everyone that this legacy continues. We have hosted high-level political leaders from different countries, nuclear survivors, and many more who have delivered impactful statements to the region. The ramifications of these tests on our islands go on. And while we continue to pursue fair and just resolution to our legacy, we continue to face other challenges, like I said, including climate change, which we consider an extension of the nuclear order, because the needs of future generations and our environment are being exploited for short-term political and financial gain. We also face new neo-nuclear challenges like the AUKUS agreement, which is going to be deploying nuclear-powered submarines into our waterways, and also the perils of nuclear energy, including Japan's Fukushima waste dumping. So for us in the Pacific, the threat of nuclear weapons is not something that's going to happen in the future. It's something that is already happening right now, and that's something that I learned when stepping into the global space. But I'm grateful to be here, and I'm grateful to listen to the stories of hope and of resilience and the strides that you've shared with us today, the power that people have to stand up to nuclear powers and to change the narrative.
Annalise, and thanks both Bedi and Beatrice for your comments. I think in terms of the sort of history of sort of anti-colonial struggle in relation to international law, for many people, it's the non-aligned movement that was the sort of catalyst or the voice of sort of a collective voice for third world states against nuclear war. And for those of you who were born after the non-aligned movement faded from newspaper headlines, it's still around, but it's no longer visible in our public sphere. The non-aligned movement was the collective of third world states that started in 1961, emerging from the 55 Bandung Conference, but started in 1961 as a collective voice that sort of navigated, to use Bedi's metaphor, between the superpowers of the Cold War, and tried to figure out a sort of alternative, a third path, as it were. but in that navigating of a third path entailed many struggles, and certainly the struggle for nuclear disarmament was one of them, and of course connected in the world of the non-aligned movement to many other struggles, to the struggles against the dominant economic orders, through initiatives such as the new international economic order, through specific contexts of injustices, so against apartheid South Africa, against settler colonialism in Palestine, that these were all seen as interrelated struggles. And so I think that's sort of one dimension, I think, of a third world approach to questions of nuclear disarmament, that these are I mean, I think things that you both have emphasized as well, that these are all interrelated in terms of how we think about what sustains and reproduces the world, but also in terms of what the possibility that the treaty provides in terms of thinking about abolition, that it is it is a sort of a portal not only into a world without nuclear weapons, but really an alternative world order. That the interconnections that make the current world order, that have produced, in some sense, a world where nuclear weapons have become normalized, is also a world where all these other injustices were normalized in some sense, and the very same structures and ideologies and imaginations that have sustained them have also sustained the reverse, and therefore fighting for abolition is also not or deeply connected to other kinds of struggles for alternative futures that which Bedi spoke to so eloquently. So that's one thing, and perhaps another thing would be that perhaps going back to the non-proliferation issue, that it challenges sort of dominant oppositions between war and peace. That it's that the dominant regime of non-proliferation is not a peace regime, but in fact yet another military regime. And in that sense, nuclear weapons are also related to the fact. I mean, as you mentioned, that one of the toxic dimensions of the world is sort of the Security Council permanent members, and of course, Security Council permanent members are not only not only is dominant anchors of a nuclear world, but they are also responsible for 70% of the of weapon production in general, outside of nuclear weapons, of conventional weapons as well. So that it also connects those kinds of dots between different kinds of trajectories of militarization. And perhaps the other thing that I think the non-aligned movement sort of represents, maybe, and again, things that you both have emphasized, is the centrality of solidarity in terms of fighting these. So these are not sort of individual struggles, or not isolated struggles, but often collective ones. And I think something like 30 years ago, in 1994, oh yeah, exactly 30 years ago, the General Assembly asked the International Court of Justice for a ruling on the illegality of nuclear weapons. And as just one sort of example, in some sense, of a collective voice. Voice against nuclear weapons, and certainly it was a non-aligned movement that drove that request for an advisory opinion in that moment. But it also perhaps this is what I'll end on, shows the limits of the non-aligned movement and the limits of the General Assembly. And I think perhaps, Bedi, precisely the kinds of issues that you spoke about, I think, and including in some traditions of third world approaches in international law, that they are so statist. And they have, in fact, relied on states to be the voice of critique, while, in fact, certainly what we learn from indigenous movements in particular, but social movements more generally, is that a purely statist approach to thinking about alternatives is not going to be a portal into an alternative future.
I mean, we hear this a lot, sort of like people who are cynical about this, like, well, yes, maybe we'll get rid of nuclear weapons when we have something worse happening, right? When there's a bigger weapon or a worse weapon. And to be honest, I mean, we already have them. I mean, look at Gaza right now, for example. Conventional weapons are being used to kill civilians a lot. We're bombing towns and cities. There's this idea that we would need a bigger bomb. So what purpose would that have in warfare more than killing a lot of civilians? We have the capacity to kill a lot of civilians. So I don't really buy into that we need a worse weapon or that it will automatically be. I mean, if you look at also the way that the military has developed, they are looking at smart weapons, high-tech weapons. They're looking at autonomous weapons, for example. A lot of the military development is this kind of precision guidance, missiles, surgical strike. I mean, we know that they don't work and they still kill civilians. But the idea that there's a military utility in wiping out whole towns, that's not really an effective military. I don't even know what it is. But yeah, I just feel like we have the ability to kill a lot of people anyway. And that is not really why we have nuclear weapons to replace that. It's a symbol. It's this, again, the perception of it being this threat, mutually assured destruction. The way I see it, it's that it's an incredibly stupid security strategy to have nuclear weapons, because if you think about it as well, I've been thinking a lot about nuclear deterrence lately, like you're basically putting your entire countries and all of your cities into the hands of your enemy and be like, I just 100% trust that you're not going to do this. And with like full confidence in Putin, he's not going to do it. I don't think that's a great strategy. Like I don't trust him. And actually there's an interesting relationship between nuclear armed states that, and I think that we saw that when the TPNW came, and they were this was the only thing that they could agree on, the 5 nuclear weapon states, that they hated this treaty. They have this weapon, and they're meant to kill each other, and they're like, we need to keep the ability to kill each other, so we will unify so that we can keep the ability to wipe out each other. Right? There's a kind of absurd, almost love relationship there between these, and that they have so much faith and trust in each other. That just feels a bit weird, right? I mean, there's a lot of illogic. I don't think it's a great strategy to put like your entire civilian populations in the hands of the enemy and just, they got this. We believe that we know exactly what they are thinking, and that they will never make a mistake, and never be irrational, never just be wrong. That seems scary. But yeah, there are of course a lot of other weapons, and I think that you asked also earlier, when do we talk about peace and when do we talk about specific weapons? And it's a hard question, right? Because we have to talk about peace as a general concept, but it's a lot easier to make political progress on a specific weapon. And I have doubts sometimes about, like, we need to talk about the broader stuff and perspectives. But I also know that when you focus, you can move forward on that issue. And that's also very important to do, both for motivational reasons, but also for like actually making a difference on specific issues. So I think there needs to be a bit of a balance there, but it means that we need to look at weapons that are emerging as well, even though we haven't tackled fully what's happening. But for example, autonomous weapons, AI, a lot of people talk about it. It's a new Manhattan project that's going on, where we are in 1944. That's where we are now in artificial intelligence in weapons. There are, of course, it's difficult to define exactly what a fully autonomous AI weapon is. We're hearing a lot, they're using it in Ukraine, Russia's using it, Ukraine is using it, Israel is using it, so we sort of hear snippets. It's not always exactly, we don't always know exactly how autonomous they are and where the line goes, but we know that they are almost here, or if they're not already here, these things. And for me, this is a massive question for humanity. Are we going to let robots decide who lives and dies? Are we going to give them the power to decide who should live and who should die? And it's also extremely relevant, I think, for lawyers and for people working in international law, because if you have no humans, well, then can there be a law? Like, can we have laws without humans? There are efforts going on right now to regulate these weapons, and I think that there were, of course, efforts to regulate nuclear weapons already in 1945. You had some of the scientists involved. Einstein, for example, was one of the people who were part of splitting the atom, and then immediately started the first petition ever against nuclear weapons. But we didn't have the same kind of public involvement in issues back then that we have now. So I also have to say, if we could prevent autonomous weapons, if we can regulate them now, we can also show people that we're actually doing better, that we've learned something. We are actually, this kind of idea that everything is getting worse might not be true. We might actually be doing some things better. So yeah, there's a lot of weapons that we need to tackle.
There's a young woman by the name of Rosenet Tinius. She's a third-generation displaced Bikinian. And during an event that we put together, she spoke about how her people were, when they were displaced from Bikini Atoll, the colonel there said that, we will be relocating you and testing these weapons for the good of mankind. So the people, being benevolent Christians and having that Marshallese principle of, okay, we'll do what we can for our community, for the world, decided to leave their islands. And so Rosenet was reflecting on that and how her people now live on Kile Atoll. And Kile is a small island. It's not an atoll. So Bikini, if you've seen photos of Bikini, it's like a ring of islands, and there's a lagoon in the middle, which provides a safe place for the people there to fish, to sail. And Kile Atoll doesn't have like the coral reef to protect it. It doesn't have a lagoon for fishing, so now the people have become dependent on imported processed foods. But during king tide season, basically the whole island is flooded. And Rosenet, reflecting on her grandmother's living situation at Kile, said, and her grandmother having to relocate again, said, my people have had to move for the good of mankind, and now we will have to move again because of mankind. So in the minds of young Marshallese people, these issues are absolutely connected. You have the Rinit Dome, but it's also the narrative of nuclear weapons that also feels that we look at very critically because of how I said, it's exploiting future generations. It's exploiting our environments. And in the Pacific, since the 1970s, these issues were linked with our sovereignty, our independence, because during that time, a lot of Pacific nations were seeking independence. And that was partly because of the fears of what colonial superpowers would do to our environments. How could they exploit it even further and then threaten our lives and livelihoods? So climate change is very much interlinked with nuclear issues. It's very interlinked with colonialism, self-determination. And I think Beatrice mentioned this, that there are so many other movements happening. In the Pacific, it's in the world. In the Pacific, it's very much the same, and we use those principles of independence, of environmental sustainability to progress the nuclear justice movement, because we say, okay, so like in West Papua, or what is known as Indonesia now, people are struggling for self-determination. Our issues are connected. And in Hawaii, where there's lots of militarism happening, and the RIMPAC nuclear test affects people negatively, they have leaks, oil leaks into their water systems, hurting people's health, threatening families. We are connected. So we try to find all of these different experiences that we all have throughout our region and connect together as young people and say, you know what, we might be fighting a different battle, but it's all the same war against the same things that are continuing to harm us. So yeah, I think it also takes a little bit of strategic planning, because sometimes we don't want our issues to be overshadowed by climate. But this past year, I went to the COP meeting for the first time in Dubai, and I found that not a lot of people are talking about the dangers of nuclear power. And in the Pacific, almost every person you've talked to, we had a Pacific panel at a nuclear event. All of us were singing the same song about, we are worried about nuclear power because everyone is promoting it as a climate solution without looking at the full cycle of uranium mining, of waste dumping, which often affects indigenous people. And so there are so many gaps that that are in both conversations, in both nuclear and climate, that we could work to fill. And we need people who have these experiences to fill them.
One thing that I was thinking about actually, that's when you were talking about alternative weapons that are, part of what is fueling the war in Gaza as well. That there is of course a military-industrial complex, as many people say. So part of the economic system is of course all of these people who are profiting from the world as it is, and directly from whether it's the development and research into nuclear weapons or the disposal of waste, all of these things are actually also systems of profiteering, as much as they're also systems of that focus on that have delivered harm and continue to produce harm in the ways that we have highlighted. So I think one element of the economic system is about addressing I think the economics of war in some sense, or of weaponizing in a whole range of sense. And of course once again there are sort of young people leading the struggle. I think in many of our campuses, for instance, I think lots of students are calling for divestment from the military-industrial complex, particularly because of Gaza, but certainly more generally as well. And I think in ways that then link to the divestment from fossil fuels and from a whole range of other things. So that's not necessarily sort of macro world system as a whole, but it is certainly one entry point into it, and to the extent that many of these struggles happen through those sort of through different kinds of entries into thinking about these things. And then, of course, there is a question of the macro world system and about the ways in which it is a particular kind of, whether we call it the broader sort of racial capitalist system in some sense that has produced nuclear weaponry and has produced nuclear weaponry is a symptom of a whole range of different kinds of things around aid and trade, and that link that are and part of elements of international law as well that need to be that are part of what we have to take on. There's in that same nuclear weapons case, when the ICJ came out with its opinion, I remember Marty Koskanemi wrote an article about we can't depend on law to address the killing of innocents. That in fact that would lead us in the wrong direction in terms of how we think about the morality of a system, or think about the political economy system. And I think but similarly I think of the political economy of the system, that we can't think of addressing these as ones that we can't without thinking about questions of economic justice. We can't think of the one thing as sort of being a magic bullet in terms of delivering on all those other issues.
There's a lot of different roles to play. I think the number one thing is really to talk about nuclear weapons, to bring it up more in conversations, to attend conferences like this, for example, is a really good start. To kind of normalize to ourselves as well that this is something that it's here and it's real, and I have the right to talk about it, and I have the right to share my opinions about it. We have a lot of course, sort of political initiatives. There's, like I mentioned, the ICAN Cities Appeal. We've had a lot of cities in the US, from Boston, New York, LA. We have also had some states, California, New Jersey, all over, many more, around the US. So local decisions are really powerful tools. Like, again, like a city cannot, of course, join the treaty formally in that way, but this is about building political pressure. We saw that was incredibly effective in the 1980s in the nuclear freeze movement that led to these massive reductions in nuclear weapons between the US and Soviet then, that I think it was something like 85% of all US cities were part of taking these motions, something like that. I'm not 100% sure about the number. But it was a huge effort, and that also really creates political pressure. Also think about that politicians very often start locally in their city councils and then go up to state level and then go up to national level. So these might also be the presidential candidates in the next decades, and anchoring these ideas early is extremely important.
Comments on those, but in terms of indigenous sovereignty, in the islands we often say, like, we've been living alongside of our environment in a sustainable way for thousands of years. So we have something that we can share with the world. We have something valuable to offer, not as victims or as, you know, passive people that things are happening to, but as knowledge bearers, as cultural bearers, and it is our independence that we need to be able to share these things freely. In the Marshall Islands, we are not a signatory of the TPNW because of the military base that is testing nuclear-capable submarines on Kwajalein Atoll, and because of the implications that our government fears the treaty might have towards relinquishing accountability to the US. And so for us, having peace is about restorative justice. It's about being able to finally be free to accomplish what we want for our people. So yeah, I think it's so important just to end this conversation, or to provide my last comments, to include everyone in the discussion. So thank you for acknowledging that. I really do believe that everyone has something to offer to this movement, no matter if you are a lawyer, an activist, an artist, even a mother or a child, an elder. And I hope that you are as inspired as I am today by what I've heard. So thank you.